Hey everyone, welcome to a video where we're going to discuss another element. Haven't done one of these in quite a while, but today I just wanted to talk about ice and why I think ice sucks right now, or in general ice just it doesn't get a lot of love right now. Most people think it's the weakest element. This was kind of inspired by Brian Camacho, Level 1 Onion Knight. He did a poll, what do you think is the strongest element, what do you think is the weakest element on his Opus 14 review. And universally, everyone, I guess, thought ice was the weakest, or it got the least votes for strongest. So why is that? I kind of wanted to look at a few aspects, because I always hear some things about ice, and just wanted to explore that. So, first of all, I have a very love-hate relationship with this element. When I first started playing, which was near the end of Opus 7, so there's a guy at my locals called Cody Snodgrass, and for the longest time, he was a mono ice player. That's all he played was light blue cards. And, discard was very prevalent back then, and I honestly hated it. I hated fighting ice because it would get you in what my opinion to this day is still the most degenerate game state where you just can't play the game. And anyone who was around before then in like Opus 5, Opus 6 knows there was a meta called Turbo Ice Discard, where they would just slam out Thaumaturge, Gaspers, and they would just junk your whole hand. So basically, you can't really play the game because you're drawing only 2 cards and you don't have any resources to use. So oftentimes, you can't even use those cards you drew. And that happened a lot too. So, in Opus 8, Cody would just constantly he'd go first, put down a backup or 2, and then here comes a lock to make me discard, or here comes Sephiroth. Sometimes Sephiroth would come down as early as turn 2. Sometimes turn 3 followed by a Shadow Flare, and just my entire hand is gone. And so then you're in top deck mode, and again, even if I have down 2 backups, if I draw a 6 CP card, I can't even cast it. I can't do anything with it. And then next turn, here comes a Shadow Flare or a Renoa, and my hand's just gone again. So for the longest time, I really hated ice. It was very miserable to play against. However, they've definitely gone away from the discard aspect, and they've much more leaned into a dull freeze aspect, and they've kind of thrown some control-esque elements out there with Gentiana, Sid Randell. So ice definitely feels very weak right now, and in particular, discard doesn't feel nearly as strong as it used to. One, they haven't printed nearly as many discard effects, and honestly, that's probably a good thing. But also, people are able to draw cards now much more frequently than they ever were before, because one of the things I often hear about ice has really bad summons, right? So we're going to get to that. We're going to look at summons in a second. But first of all, I wanted to look at EX Burst, because in my opinion, this is another thing ice really struggles with right now. I don't think it has very many good bursts. So let's take a look at them. All right, so here we have FF decks. I've loaded up Ice, EX Burst. We've got every Ice EX Burst that's been printed to this point. A lot of these cards, you just don't pick anymore. Here's some summons. We'll kind of go over those in more detail. This Lagoon is never used. I still like this Jill Nabat, although obviously it's only really relevant when they have 2 dull forwards. None of these are really used anymore. Sid Alstein, I can't remember the last time he resolved on a burst. Sephiroth, Umaro's never used. Shiva, you could still throw in a Shiva-S deck, but I don't think the Shivas all kind of struggle too, and we'll go into that more at the summons. Mute is a solid burst, but he's very specific. Some of these have, like Sarah is solid, the Mute, but again, this isn't like generic ice stuff, and I think that's what ice can be sorely lacking. So in my opinion, the last great burst ice has is from Opus 6, and it says Kuja. It's just on a burst, dull freeze, a forward. And, that's something that, as a burst, it can prevent you from dying. If someone's going to go in for their 7th point of damage, and they've got 2 attackers, and they go in for 0.6, if you hit Kuja on 0.6, you can dull freeze that last forward so they can't get you. There's this Shiva from Opus 7. Again, I'll touch on the summons more. Emperor, I like this card a lot, but, and this is a point I'll allude to now, that a lot of these effects are conditional. So this Emperor only works if you're on damage 4 or higher. So before then, the burst doesn't even go off. Freeze all forwards on a burst, really cool, though this card never saw play. I like this similar to Jill Nabat. Freeze ice forwards, although again, you gotta have another number of characters. The Setzer's good, but it's only for a 6-base deck. We had a reprint of Mateus. Quistis is solid, but again, only in an 8-base deck. Sid Alstein, he's just a different version of the other Sid Alstein. And again, his effect could be, if he was just dull freeze no matter what, he could be really good, but it only works if your opponent has 2 cards or less in hand. If you hit this when your opponent has a bigger hand, it doesn't do anything. And so that's like, for me, the three big things with Ice is that it has bad EX bursts, the summons aren't very good, and the effects are very inconsistent. And when I say inconsistent, what I really mean is that they're very conditional. This is a very conditional effect on this Sid Alstein. Again, Dull Freeze on a burst, just like Kuja, but it only works if they have 2 cards or less in hand. The Dragon is really nice in a mono ice deck because its burst draw you a card, really nice. This Mind Flayer isn't too bad. And unfortunately, I never got much use, but just dull something that will not only prevent a point of damage, it will let you draw. You have Nole, again, fine. Any of the Searcher bursts are good, but of course they're specific. You can't jam that into any ice deck. It's got to be specific. Same with the Terra. It's specifically going to search for summon. It's fine. Not a bad one. The Shivan, I don't think ever saw play. Idolus is probably the second best burst it has next to the Kuja in the sense of just, again, it's just a generically good card. The only time this isn't going to fire is if they hit you turn 1 before you've done anything, or you've only thrown ice summons in your break zone. This is almost always going to get you back a card. So Idolus is another really good one. Kadaj is fine, but again, he only works if you're playing the Remnant package. Shiva is okay, 6,000 damage. If they're at 5, it's 9, which is really good. Usually this is going to go off because to attack, they had to go dull, unless, of course, they have Brave. Look at this Nuge. When he enters the field, choose a character opponent controls. If your opponent has 2 cards or less in their hand, dull it and freeze it. So in theory, dull freeze on a backup off a burst is great, but again, they have to have 2 cards or less. So there's a lot of times that can whiff. Shiva, this one is actually quite solid, but I think one of the issues with this card is that it just costs so much. That would be my guess. I think for 2, this is great, but dull freezing 2 forwards is really good. The Tella, you can get back a summon in your break zone. The Kefka's fine. The dull on, it'll prevent a point of damage. That's fine. The Shivan. The Shivan is one of the ones that really inspired me to talk about this point, because this card, I like this card a lot. I think it's actually a good summon. It's awful on a burst, though. Not once has it ever mattered on a burst, because for it to matter on a burst, you have to have a forward, and it has to be active. Because if your forward is dull, then them getting power is irrelevant because they can't block anything. Now, I guess, yes, you could say, if they were going to, zap you for damage, the Chivalry raising its power. Did I say Shivan earlier? Yeah, the Chivalry raising its power could matter, but ideally what you want is that it gets the power boost, then you block something, you kill one of their forwards, and now they also have to discard. So you have to have an active forward that can block, but you also have to have already let a point of damage through, right? And then they have to have another attacker, which the Chivalry will now stop them from doing. So at least in my experience, this hasn't been relevant on a burst a single time. Again, like the card, the burst is really bad. So I think Ice could do with some more consistent bursts. And the thing is, too, though, about stuff that dulls like this, again, it's only relevant if they have multiple attackers. So a lot of times early game, people are just getting their board started. They'll swing in for a single attack, hit the Kefka. It's like, okay, cool, except it's already dull, so it didn't actually even do anything for me anyway. And, a lot of people mention that, too, is because Ice is so reliant on their forwards have to be dull to do something, that can cause an issue too. But so yeah, again, there's an inconsistency there. It's not as like a Kukulane or a Belias. Those will always at minimum draw you a card, right? So maybe we should give a card like this more often, because that way, even if that forward's already attacked, we can draw a card. So those are some of the bursts. Let's look at Ice Summon, shall we? All right, so assuming FF Dex is accurate, which I'm assuming it is, we have a total of 26 Ice Summons in the game. A lot of these earlier ones just aren't really good anymore. This one, the original Shiva, forward, dull it, freeze it on a burst, still not technically bad. This one has been power crept by the Opus XIV Shiva. Hades, choose a forward and backup opponent controls, dull the forward, return the backup to its owner's hand. Your opponent discards a card from his hand. Kind of a weird effect that it bounces. Maybe you could do something I don't know. This card's interesting. I've seen some people use it to good effect. I wish it didn't give them back a card. So, in theory, if they had nothing in hand, you could dull the forward and then bounce the backup, and then they're forced to discard that backup. But nowadays, I just feel like that's going to hurt you more than it would help. So this one's kind of irrelevant. Mateus the Corrupt, opponent puts attacking forward in the break zone. 5 CP, yeah. No one uses this anymore. This Shiva, 2 forward opponent controls, dull them. A lot of this stuff has been kind of power crept. So here we have Zalira, the Death Seraph. I definitely want to talk about this because Ice doesn't really have any board wipes, right? This is probably their closest thing to a board wipe. You know, we got a new Hecaton Kyra revealed for Opus 15. It's an Earth summon, and it deals 8,000 damage to all the forwards, including your own. And I was just like, why is Earth getting this card? Earth has Shantoto, Earth has Titan. Earth doesn't have an issue wiping the board clean. So why is that there? And this Zalira, it's a neat card, but honestly, for me, it's fallen out of favor too. One, at 4 CP, it can sometimes feel expensive. But again, expensive only because of the conditions. First of all, the 4s it breaks have to be dull, and then they have to be prime numbers. Currently, there's no 13 in the game. 11 obviously can finally hit Montleonis. Or I should say there's an 11 cost card that can finally hit. But if it's not a 2, 3, 5, or 7, it doesn't do anything. And, you know, some decks that's really good against. You know, that will take out a Sophie or a Sarah Mobius or a Lena. But it doesn't attack Doga. It doesn't hit Tenzin, who's probably going to struggle to become brave anyway, or dull anyway. It doesn't hit 4 costs, so Stern Leonis, or, you know, Wool or Garland. Those cards, it doesn't matter when they become dull because they're a 4 cost. So while it's a neat card, and back in the day it was certainly a lot stronger, again, there's just these conditions to it. And I think that's a big thing holding back a lot of these Ice summons is they all have these like conditions, these attachments to it. So yeah, a Zaliro, you know, what if they attack with a single forward and then leave another one up? So now you don't even have the choice to target 2, even if, you know, you can't hit 2, even if both of them are technically prime numbers. So it is nice that it doesn't target. I mean, I still like the card, but I think Ice needs something else. I don't think this is enough to cut it. This Shiva, obviously you would use this in a Shiva deck to really pump that damage. Deal each forward opponent controls damage equal to half of its power. So again, you're paying 4 CP. You're hitting the whole board, but I mean, unless you're casting 2 Liches, like, yeah, it's 8 CP. So I mean, I guess you could do that, but that means you have to have 2 Liches in hand. I don't know. I've never seen this card used. I even just had to read this now. Glacial Ableist is, in my opinion, still the best Ice summon. And the reason is because this card is always good. This card does not require a situation. At minimum, you can, even if they don't have a forward on the field, you can always make them discard from hand. If they only have a single forward, when they move to combat, you can cast Glacial Ableist, you can dull it and freeze it, so you're preventing a point of damage this turn and the next turn. If they have a dull forward already, you can hit it for 7,000 damage. It's really good card against things like Opus 8 Water Zidane, which doesn't have an on-attack effect. So when it dulls, boom, you hit it for 7, and then you make them discard. So that's why I love Glacia so much, is because it's just always good. It doesn't have this condition, well, if it's dull, and if it's a prime number, and if they have a certain amount of cards in hand. No, it's just Glacia is, in my opinion, great. Mateus the Corrupt, choose a blocking forward. Haven't seen this one much, but I've seen a lot of people use that one for fun. Doom Train, really good dull damage back in the day, although again his cost was dependent on cards in hand. Hades, I actually still kind of like this one, just because it breaks any dull forward. I find it good for cards that Zalira cannot get, and then the discard on top of it, but definitely expensive. And again, it still has the caveat of course, they have to be dull, but that's what a lot of Ice does. This Shiva, it's a cool on a burst, but if it's not on a burst, all it does is a double freeze. It doesn't dull cards. We're going to come back to this because that's going to be important later. You know, only on a burst does it do a dull and freeze. If you cast it normally, it's just the freeze. This Shiva, the Opus 8 one, I love this card. I thought this card was so cool. Choose up to 3 forwards or monsters, dull and freeze them. So dull, freezing 3 on your board, awesome. However, they put the caveat on there that you can only cast this during your turn, which at the time was probably necessary, because I think that would have felt really bad. Your opponent goes to attack, now you dull and freeze, because dulling and freezing on your opponent's turn is way stronger, because not only are they not attacking that turn, they're also not going to be active for the next turn. Whereas if you do it on your turn, you're basically only making them skip 1 combat. But again, unfortunately, it can only be cast during your turn, which, similar to that new Hecaton that got released in Earth, or that's going to be released in Earth, that kind of defeats the purpose of a summon. You know, a summon that can only be used on your turn. That kind of, you know, the point of the summon is the surprise interaction. So I like that card a lot, but I can see why it doesn't get a lot of play. Again, this Shiva is just damage. We have so many Shivas that just deal damage to a dull forward, so that's like just not interesting. This Zalira is great simply because of its cost. It can't get Montleonis, which is kind of funny, but that doesn't matter. You know, this is usually my Zalira of choice just because of the cost. But again, it can still only target prime numbers, so there's a lot of cards that this Zalira just can't even do anything about. Mind Flayer, man, this poor mono Shiva just never got any love. But again, look at the specificity. They have to have an active forward and a dull one. You dull the former and then deal the latter 9,000 damage. And then, of course, there's that other Shiva effect, but none of those Shivas are really that great. Shiva never got any love. This Shiva is cheap, easy ping, but clearly people didn't like that. Carbuncle I actually like quite a bit. I've enjoyed using this card. So the good thing is you always get one effect no matter what. Thank goodness. However, if you get their hand low, you get 2 effects out of it. Shiva, I thought was a cool card. You know, 2 CP, potentially do 10,000 damage, but again, it's contingent upon the amount of cards they have in hand. So that gets to our last 2. This Shiva is, effect-wise, it's really good, especially at damage 5. 2 CP, dull freeze 2 forwards, and it'll do that on a burst. I actually think that's quite good. However, why doesn't it see any play? Maybe no, because no one wants to pay 5 for it. That would be my guess, is that for 2 CP, that's a great effect. Nobody wants to pay 5 for it. And then the Chivalry. The Chivalry is a great combat trick. It can just help something survive. When a summon costs 2, and that's another thing too, even cost summons are kind of better than odd cost ones, because if it's 2, you can pitch a single card from hand to cast a Chivalry. Whereas if it's an odd cost, let's say it's 3, if you don't leave a backup up, then you're having to pitch 2 cards from hand from that. Or again, you're leaving up CP in case you need to use it. Again, I like the card, just kind of sucks on a burst. So here's the ice summons, right? And people always say, well, ice has no good summons. And I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure what everyone wants from that. And that's a question I definitely ask the viewers here is like, please let me know in the comments below. What do you think would make a good ice summon? Like, what do you want to see on an ice summon? What would make an ice summon good? Is it something more like Glacial Ableist that whatever its effects are, you can just use it at any time? Because to me, that's what stands out the most to me when I look at these is so many of these are conditional, right? Now, of course, ice is already conditional because of the whole dull effect, so a lot of these have to already hit a dull target. But then on top of that, maybe it's got to be a prime number, maybe it's got to be blocking, maybe it's got to, they have to have 2 cards or less in hand. So is it an inconsistency? What would you like to see on an ice summon? Do you want a Shiva that is naturally 2 CP and then just dull freezes 2 forwards? Do you want it to be able to attack characters, backups? Make them discard. So I'd be very curious to hear what people actually want out of ice summons. And then the last thing I wanted to look at that I think ice struggles with is very, again, inconsistent or conditional effects. So here I've pulled up Opus 12, 13, and 14, and we're just going to look at all the ice cards that we got in this set. And you can just see like a lot of the conditional effects. Necron, he fits in a very certain playstyle with dark and passive damage, which has, of course, been completely made irrelevant by Sophie anyway. Olmia is specifically a mono ice card that can help them. I actually kind of like that card. Amidat Lion, again, a neat effect, but kind of high rolly, right? That might not work. Ajnatarl, it's got to wait a turn, so you can then do another high rolly effect. Eduardo, cool, but it's only on entry, and then that special is, again, very kind of specific to play around. Emmett Selk was, I think, a neat idea, but he barely saw any play because past damage, other than damage 5, he doesn't actually do anything. He's just a body, and he's dependent on the type of deck you face. Some decks struggle to get rid of him, other decks have no issue just putting him out of the way. Again, the Scholar, choose a forward until the end of the turn, it loses haste for Striking Brave. Cool, but very specific. Gunbreaker's Party. This Emperor, I mean, look at their legends. Yeah, I just want to focus on the legends here for a second. This Emperor was just such a missed opportunity. So he had this neat idea of like recycling the Emperors, and you had to put all. But when you put a bunch of Emperors in the deck, you can't put them all on the field at the same time. They have a unique name, so you can only have one. He has to enter the field. You have to have these other Emperors, and then they discard. And then again, he's got like this recursion effect, but he's only a 5k body. He wasn't that big. Just all for a single discard. You had to do all these things for a single discard, and I'll touch on that on Emperor effect later. The Bell was pretty generically good. That was nice. The Snow was terrible. Here's some of the multi-element ones. I don't really count those because they obviously build into something else. Quistis is good in the 8 stuff. There's the Shiva. Sid Randell Really neat card. Like this card a lot. Obviously still struggles probably just because the body's so weak. Charlotte is a great card. This is what Ice needs more of. Cards like this that it's a magnet you want to pay for, and then on damage 3 she becomes really strong. The Squall it's funny, the Squall card actually sucks for what it does, but it enables the Laguna down here, and the Laguna is good. So, and again, cool little 8 combo, but you have to play the 8 cards. They're all tied to the 8 cards. She's tied to mannequins. This one was tied to the Cascade effect. Physalis is a legend that overall I'm just kind of on. Like, I've seen her put in a lot of work. Her special is undoubtedly good. 10,000 damage to anything. Doesn't have to be dull. That's very important. And they discard. Great special. But as far as her normal effect, I mean, you would think, again, on entry and attack, that's great, right? Except, again, they have to have 3 cards or less. Sometimes that's very easy to achieve. Sometimes they have a full hand and you can't even get that effect off. So again, compare that to even right down here. Look at in the same set, White Tiger Lysine Nimbus, who, yeah, he's multi-elements. That's why he has the bonus. On entry and attack, he's going to dull freeze a character regardless. It doesn't matter what their hand size is. You know, look at 9 from Cadets. On entry attack, he's making them lose power regardless. So, yeah. Physalis is interesting, but again, it has this condition of being tied to discard that to consistently get her effects off, you got to be able to do that. Levnato was like summon based, so I was going to use him. Here's the multi-element ones. Scroll back up. Celestia's great, but obviously multi-element. This Emmett Selk is a very specific need. This Titania was neat for the starter set. And technically it's above curve, right? It's a 2-cost, 8k body, and dull freezing 2 characters is very strong on entry, but of course it had its casting restriction. Still a great card off of Phoenix. Again, here's this Camelot. I love this card. This is a great mono card, but it has a condition that I'm going to tie to Kefka here, which I also love this card. Great. This is what mono elements should be. It's difficult to achieve, and it should be, but it's a very inexpensive, repeatable effect that you can also use on their turn. That action ability is fantastic. However, as much as I love this Kefka and this Camelot, look what they both have to do for their effects. You have to have a bunch of backups. If you want that Camelot to hit for 8k, 10k, you got to have all your backups. Same with this Kefka. Love this card, but even playing something with my 6 package where I can fetch out backups, there's some games I just can't get to that 5th backup, but I can't use this effect. So it's still effects that are contingent upon something else. Look at this Gilgamesh. Why is this Gilgamesh in ice? Haste and First Strike and Brave aren't even ice keywords. So I don't know why. Like, yeah, he dull freezes, and he requires all these other elements. Like, I don't know much about the game, so maybe in the game he's very ice themed, but I just don't see why this had to be an ice card. You could have put this legend, this is a multi-element legend, in any color. It could have been light or dark. That would have honestly made a little more sense. Like, or put it in Earth where there's already a bunch of color fixing. But no, it's the Ice legend. Ice loses one of its legend slots to this guy that has, again, these very specific requirements. Look at this Emperor. Again, a very low body Emperor who he has to enter the field through an ability to even get an effect. Without that, he's blank. He's blank. And his effect, you remove 15 ice cards from the break zone from the game. That's a lot. That even in mono ice, that is a lot of ice cards to remove. To play him onto the field, and then you reveal, but if you reveal a summon, you don't even get the card, like, so you can pay 15 ice cards to put him onto the field to potentially not even do anything. And you can only do it on your turn. If you could do it a back attack, do it on your opponent's turn, I'd get it. But again, look at these conditions. All these conditions. Here's Mogomog. He fits in with the Mog thing. Adam's kind of neat. I like him. Shiva was actually ended up being all right. Maybe this is kind of more of the things Ice needs. This generic, when she enters the field, you dull a character, freeze the board. That's it. Even if you don't use her action ability, you know, that where she can flicker herself, she comes in, she freezes the whole board. Very Ice effect. So I think that is something Ice is definitely struggling with, is that, again, a lot of these effects are so conditional. So let's talk about that being conditional. All right, so we have 2 choices if we want to make Ice better, at least as far as I see it. You can either remove the dull targeting aspect. That is a very easy and I think bad way to do it. So you say Ice is just like Fire now. The forge don't have to be dull, because that's a huge disadvantage for Ice, right? Because now you have something like Braska's Final Aeon. Yeah, you can hit it once with Azalira, But when you're going to trigger it too, if he's dull, he probably already attacked, meaning he already got one of his attack things off. So you could just remove the dull trigger, just make it like fire and say, you target anything, boom, that's a huge boost ice, right? However, that completely takes away the uniqueness of the element. I don't personally want everything to just become fire, where everything just targets indiscriminately. Back in the day in those Opus 1 cards, the fire summons always did less than the ice and the lightning ones because they had requirements. That made sense. The more requirements you put on a card, the more things you put on it to pull it back, then the positive effect needs to be that much higher. I don't like that at all, but, technically it's an option. Let's explore a space we haven't explored at all, which is freezing. As everyone knows, freezing kind of only matters when something is dull. If you freeze an active character currently, it doesn't matter, because what freezing literally does is it says that character will not activate during that controller's next active phase. Well, if all their backups are frozen but active, it doesn't do anything. So why don't we give some abilities that actually interact with frozen cards? John Schreiner's talked about this before too. Like, why not have this Shiva Primal? This was a perfect chance to do it, and they didn't do it. Or you can put on a summon or whatever. Have a Shiva that has Diamond Dust, that whether it's its actual ability or a special or whatever, and says, hey, break every frozen forward they control. So now when you do that, you can drop this, that art card, whatever it was, the GX art guy from Opus 8, freeze all their forwards. Now here comes this Diamond Dust, break. They don't have to be dull. They don't have to be a prime number, but it's not just generic break things because they have to be frozen. So you're still fitting in your ice theme of these cards have to be frozen. Why not have something could attack backups that way? Hey, a frozen backup, can't be dulled for CP this turn, or can't use any of its abilities. If it has a dull ability, it can't use, I don't know, so, however you want to phrase it. But so that way, even if you can't dull and freeze, just freezing still gives you a whole new avenue to explore. And there's so much they could do with that. And again, it would make freezing so much more relevant, because right now, if it's not dull, then the freezing is pointless. So I think that would really fit into Ice's theme. Another thing you could do is to just ramp up the dull effects. Lean into the dull theme. Say, okay, Ice will still have the whole it has to target dull, but ramp everything up. And again, the damage could be higher, and it probably should be higher because, again, it has to be dull to hit it. And you can make the effects stronger, So normally if you would have a card that comes in and says target a dull forward, that owner's card discards. Okay, well now how about not only does it discard, and they freeze it as well. We saw that on like the Sephiroth Ice Lightning multi-element, but that was a multi-element. So, if you're going to stick with these conditions that Ice has to target dull things, Lightning has to target active, you can make those effects above curve because that's the point. They have this condition, so that way they're a little stronger when they do happen. Last thing you could probably do, you could try to push discard again. I don't know if I would want to see that because, again, when discard is very rampant, it creates a very unfun game state where you just don't even feel like you're playing the game. You could do, and I hesitate to suggest this because I hate cards like this, but Opus 3 Zidane has targeted discard. You could do something with targeted discard. They kind of did that with Don Corneo, except again, look at Don Corneo. They still get to, choose 3 of their cards. So they got 5 cards in hand. They still have this conditional aspect. It's not just this generic effect. Look at that Zidane. He's a perfect example. That Zidane can be put into any win deck and he makes it better because his effect is so strong. He's not required to be played in a 9 deck. He's not required to be played in like a 3 CP or less deck. So I think Ice could definitely use more cards like that this is just a good card I kind of want to put anywhere. And I think they hit the mark on that with Charlotte, and then they just need more of that. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Ice and where I kind of think it's at and some things I think could be done to improve it. Please let me know, what do you think of Ice? Is it an element you even like? Do you not care about it at all? And specifically, if nothing else, please tell me about the summons, because I always see that Ice has bad summons, and I don't disagree, and I went through quite a few of those are bad, but what do you want to see in an Ice summon? And I mean be specific, like what should it cost? What does it do? Does it dull freeze 3 forwards when you cast it? How much does it cost? Does it have any restrictions, etc.? So because, we got a new Terra card that's coming out in Opus 15, but again, it's tied to Ice summons, and people point out, well, there's no good Ice summons, so why would I want to play this Terra card? So let me know what you think. I appreciate you watching, and we'll talk to you later. Take care.